Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. And I'm your host, Isaac Levin. If you're enjoying the interviews here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you're interested or know any folks that would be interested in coming on chatting, feel free to ask me on Twitter. My handle there is Isaac R. Levin. All right, so with that out of the way, I'm excited for my conversation. We were talking in the green room the entire time, and I almost forgot to do all the tech setup. So I'm really looking forward to it. And let's just get right into the conversation. My guest today is Jenn Junod. Jenn, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself.
Hello, hello, beautiful humans. My name is Jenn Junod. I am the host of Teach Gen Tech and Shit You Don't Want to Talk About. I also MC, a Developcado, or a devrel, as most people call it, and all around just all about mental health and neurodiversity in tech.
I think there's a lot of things that we're gonna talk about. Like the neurodiversity stuff is really interesting. The developer relations stuff is interesting. I just like the phrase developcado. I'm just gonna say that. Like I hear that before I joined like the DevRel space, I always saw it and I thought it was very, very cute. And I'm glad that people are still carrying it. It wasn't just like a flash in the pan thing. So that's really, really awesome. I want to start our conversation just talking a little bit about your tech origin story. I think it's always great to hear how people get started in tech. Like, do you recall like the first time you came across technology or software or open source or whatever you want to, kind of attach your thought to and just tell me what your thought process was?
Yeah, well, I can't say I officially remember the first time. I do
Sure.
remember things of like my dad doing things in DOS, and then also wanting to, oh gosh, when Linux was in like early 90s, there was this like game that you would go through, and it was kind of like a puzzle, and like you'd have to back out of rooms if it was a dead end. And I was so obsessed with that game. I absolutely love that game. So those are like my first memories
Sure.
of tech.
Yeah.
My dad was also somebody that he was like, he had to get the VCR, and I feel like I'm totally dating myself right now.
No, not at all. Yeah.
The first Nintendo, all of that. And we had the first PlayStation. He was really, really into all this technology. And for myself, it was like, cool, I want to become a computer engineer. That's just what I want to do. Cool. I love humans, but psychology,
Yeah.
computer science is faster, makes more money. Let's go with that. My first, and this is, gosh, 2010. I'm going to my first like computer science course. I'm already failing through math like nobody's business, but I go through and it's a C++ class. And I paid someone to do my homework for me. I found
Yeah.
them on Craigslist because I needed to pass this class.
Sure.
And I say that because I'm dyslexic.
Mm.
And I thought that I was failing math because I'm stupid. I thought I couldn't figure out computer science because I was stupid. What I didn't understand was I just swap a lot of stuff or don't see it
Yeah.
or skip over things. And that was like my kind of start into more of a computer science background. Yet at the same time, my first like real adult job was at Verizon, a mobile carrier. For those who are international, you may not know who Verizon is. And it was right when iPhones launched. So it was learning, going from like a BlackBerry and a Palm Pilot and a Trio to iPhone and Android, and
Yeah.
not, and this is something that I've realized in the last couple months, realizing I knew what open source was without knowing what open source was, because I would explain to people, if you want to be able to customize your Android, go like, if you want to be able to customize, go open source with Android. But if you want things
Do.
to just work, is how I would explain it, go with iPhone.
Sure.
And this
Sure.
is why to this day I have an iPhone, because
Sure.
I'd always have to fix people's Android's devices.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
yeah,
Sorry.
it's fast forwarded from there, and that is how I got started in my tech journey.
That's fascinating, and I think we're of a similar age. So I think that the juxtaposition of going from like you're talking about things that are very like analog, like VCRs and even like Nintendo, like I sometimes like reminisce of like blowing out the cartridges in Nintendo, like, or
Hmm.
having to clean like the PlayStation disc. Like, I imagine you probably still have to do that with Xbox or PlayStation, but I don't really game anymore. But like just like that tactile feeling of like I need to do something to make this thing work, right?
Hmm.
And I think that we lose a lot of that in technology now because the expectation is like, oh, this one thing that I'm working on is dependent on 50,000 other things, turtles all the way down, and if something isn't working, I might not have any idea on what is broken or who needs to fix it, right? So like we've been completely kind of abstracted away from like being able to solve the problem ourselves in a lot of cases without knowing a ton of domain knowledge on that particular thing. So I do sometimes reminisce of like, oh, it's as simple as blowing out the cartridge or cleaning the thing
Hmm.
or cleaning the heads on your VCR. Like I totally respect that. So like that weird juxtaposition of going from then to now is very interesting. I also like what you were saying about like phones. Like if you want like customization and configurability, go with Android. If you just want stuff to work, do the iPhone. I will say though, I know plenty of people who can't like figure out iPhone either. So like I've like I think we've all had to be tech support for someone in our family. It's like I can't get my iPhone to connect to my iCloud or whatever, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So it is very interesting that like there is this Apple's done a very, very good job of saying like, oh, like our operating system and our tool chain just works. And in Android,
Hmm.
it's like you get the full range of all of your emotions. So it is pretty interesting.
It is, and that is something that I actually started doing when I worked at Verizon was work on teaching people how to use their devices.
Oh,
So
that's cool.
that was part of the role of teaching everyone. And it's so cute because we would have all these like older people, you like learning how to do it and working together, and a lot of times it would be like little old couples. It was
Yeah.
adorable.
I mean, I specifically remember my dad like went and took like a like office proficiency class or like a word proficiency class like when I was in high school.
Ooh,
And I
yeah.
remember and I mean I remember and he was talking to me about like, oh, they showed me how to like insert images into Word. And I was just like, you like somebody had to teach you how to do that? Like and I was like, like an asshole 15-year-old at the time who like knew how to like build web pages. But it's just really funny. It's like if you were born before this tech revolution, you had to learn it, right? And now
Hmm.
I see my kids, and you hand them a device, and they use the touch screen almost immediately, and they know how to use it. To the effect that if they like walk up to a screen and they touch it, and it's not a touch screen, they're like this screen's broken, right? Like
Oh, wow.
it's
Oh,
so I
that's
mean
fun.
it's just like built into people's brains now. Like if they're born and they have these devices everywhere, like the expectation is, yeah, I touch it and it responds to my gesture, which is really interesting.
Hmm. Hmm. I think that's something that is a big reason why I started Teach Gen Tech, actually, is
Mm,
because so many people find it hard to break into tech.
sure.
Myself included, but this is why both of my shows, I always do my best to do what I call bus chucking myself, which like there's this term that is called bus chuck someone, and it's like getting them in trouble for something because you don't want to get in trouble,
Sure.
or like, um, and so I use the term bus chucking myself because I'd rather ask these awkward questions of to this day, if I am in a Word doc or a Google doc and it tells me the little wrap thing of an image, I'm just like, I, I just want you to go there. Can't you just go there? Like, can't you just like know where can't this be
Yeah.
like Canva? Like Canva, I can just put it there.
Yeah.
And Google Docs, I'm just like, okay,
Yeah, no, it's
put it
I mean
out.
we can go down a completely rabbit hole on like the idea of like software that makes our lives almost too easy.
Mhm.
Like my wife does a lot of DIY graphic design sort of stuff, and she was doing it all in Photoshop, and she found out about Canva, and she's like, I can do things like 8x faster because all like the
Mhm.
stuff is already built for me. And I think that's really cool. But I think also in a couple of years or whatever, like we're going to see a lot of people sort of lose a lot of those skills we were so dependent on currently or even previous years, right? Like we get into this, I think we're getting into the state now where we have all these tools now, and the
Mhm.
goal is to be as proficient as possible in as many tools, which is almost impossible. I've talked about this on my show, like, master of none sort of concept. But I think the having to know everything is valuable, but also specific specialization is very interesting too. And I'd like
Mhm.
to kind of get your thought is like, at some point you probably found out like an area of tech that you were interested in. Like you were working in customer support, tech support at Verizon. Like at one point in time, did you kind of gradually move into this learning area where you're kind of in now?
To go kind of into what you were just talking about of like the tools that we have and having too many tech stack, but also the accessibility of tools does lead into like how I found my way into things.
Hmm.
Um, when I hear thinking about tools like Canva to Photoshop, for example,
Yeah,
it does make it much more accessible to many, many people being able to use Canva. Yet it is very, very irritating when you can't do all the things that you can do in Photoshop. And that happens in video editing software a lot of times too. I interned as a videographer and figured out not my cup of tea, yet I can edit things on TikTok, for example, that I cannot edit in Final Cut,
sure.
or I can't like get it unless I use Final Cut. I can't get it done, and it drives me bonkers. It's a big reason that I don't use uh, Descript to edit my videos because it doesn't do things in a more technical way.
Sure.
And you mentioned something like saying a master of none, and that phrase um, is a jack of all trades is a master of none, oftentimes better than a master of
Yep.
one.
Yep.
And I say that because I actually have um, a badge on my backpack that says Jenn of all trades, and I
Oh,
say
cool.
that because I am very, very uh, if I don't want to say a master of, but this is why I say like I love human connection because it can take me in so many different directions. If I'm going to be a master of anything, it's going to be the master of saying fuck it. Like that is what I want to be the master of. Like if that's my one thing, that is what I choose.
Yeah.
Um, Everything else though is very open, and for myself, I love learning about, for example, how with why I was interviewing with a company called Ivan. Maddie was on the show a few months ago. I was interviewing with that company, and I didn't know much about databases at all or data infrastructure. So I was like, okay, cool. Let's learn more. I'm applying for jobs here, and it was so cool of seeing how I can build something with a tool like Prisma, using a
Yes.
tool with Ivan, and then being able to push it out and like use something like Netlify. Yes, I just, for anybody that is a super noob, I just used a bunch of like lingo that, believe me, I probably even used the example of Netlify wrong. Um, I think it's absolutely fascinating. And for myself, it's hard for me to choose, I want to go down this track exactly without knowing what's out there. And I'm still in that phase of, I mean, I only started Teach Gen Tech 6 months ago. Yes, I'm 60 episodes in, but there's so much to learn out there.
Oh,
I
yeah.
just started looking into serverless and being able to comprehend going from, brass racks to bare metal to, serverless, and being able to comprehend that. Or I've been talking to a lot of Web3 companies and being able to comprehend that kind of stuff. I'm just like, there's so much out there, and it is can be very, very complicated, and going down the rabbit hole, like you can really niche down in all of these. Yet I love knowing the overall of things.
Yeah.
And also I think this is why I love emceeing, because I'm like, I get to ask all of the questions
Yeah. Yeah.
ever.
I mean, I'll we were talking about this before we started streaming. Like the whole reason why I do this show is to be able to have conversation with folks and geek out about tech and learn about people's passions in tech, right? So I subscribe to everything you just said. The thing that I love the most about, folks like you that are learning in, I guess, learning in the real, or learning like, I guess, out in the world, instead of just like learning stuff like, and then just showing content that they built, right? Like
Mhm,
learning live is very, very interesting to me. And I think one of the things that's very, very interesting is that if you bring your personality to it, like folks are going to, have that level of empathy, they're going to have that level of connection, and that's really, really valuable, right? Because I think, and I said this earlier, like there are too many options in technology. Like
mhm.
there's too many tech jobs. There's not enough people that are skilled for tech jobs, and there's too many tools out there. And I can imagine now being somebody getting started and being just being like just completely analysis paralysis out of it, right? And like finding content that aligns to what I'm interested in is almost essential to be able to stick with tech. And
Mhm.
I think, I'd love to kind of get more about your thought process of like when you want to learn something new, like what paths you go down to kind of figure it out. Is it, hey, I've heard about this, I see a lot about this on tech social media, I should learn it? Or do you kind of just follow the train of like, I'm working on something and like, oh, like a lot of these docs talk about this thing, and maybe I should learn this thing too? Like, do you do it like in a sequential way, or do you kind of do it a bit more chaotic where you just kind of follow what you're seeing on social media and other things?
Both. Solid
Okay.
both.
Solid both.
Um,
Great answer.
this
Solid both.
is this is something that I think is why I talk so adamantly about like being able to say fuck it and get started. Like
Mm-hmm.
that is how I started my stream and how like, I'm able to learn live and ask these questions, like bus checking myself. Yet one thing that I really struggle with is strategy. Strategy and I are not friends. We like I'm still need to finish reviewing my past videos and getting their time codes done, or scheduling and sitting down and getting videos done for shit you don't want to talk about podcast. And like, strategy and I are not friends.
Sure.
So that being said, is I've had to learn myself, and this has been a big process of getting into tech, is allowing myself to just be open
Yeah.
of one thing that I think is the worst thing to ask somebody when they're just getting into tech is, oh, well, what language do you want to learn?
Yeah. Yeah.
How are they going to know?
Yeah.
What do you want to do?
Yeah.
Like half the time they're wanting to do it because it makes a lot of
I
money and
want to
it
make
looks
money.
cool.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think that's the part that I appreciate my time at GoDaddy that taught me enough about like, I know what hosting is kind of, or I know what domains are and DNS and, you know, it's they definitely piled on top of each other. Yet I've worked for an API company. I am at a part of a co-organizer of the Denver API meetup. I absolutely love working with people in the API world. And APIs are probably not something that I'm 100% like super excited about. It's
Sure.
like
Sure.
they're cool, yet I would say more like serverless things or cloud or containers or like data infrastructure, that kind of stuff. I'm just like, I just find it so fascinating. Where APIs, I'm just like, they're cool. They're cool.
Yeah.
Like they're needed. Don't get
Sure.
me wrong. And I want to support it, but I'm like, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I also think in general, like APIs are kind of I don't want to say misidentified, but they're kind like people don't understand like the entire world runs on APIs, right?
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
you call an Uber on your phone, there's an API there. You check your
Hmm.
email, there's an API there, right? It's like literally like APIs are something that's just the entire breadth of your being, if you use technology, has some sort of API hit. But like the underlying technology, it's like it can be anything. Like you're talking about serverless, you're talking about containers, you're talking about the other things, right? That's like interesting, right? So
I think
and I think as you get farther and farther down, it gets a bit more interesting. But at the top level, you're like, okay, like web services, that's cool, I guess. But I
Yeah.
totally get what you're saying. Like it's very interesting. Um, yeah, you mentioned that you worked at GoDaddy. I'd love to kind of talk a little bit about, what are some of the things, because GoDaddy is for folks that don't know, they're, I don't know if they still are like the largest like DNS provider, hosting provider in the world, right? Like, what were some of the things that you like? I'm guessing that you learned a lot working in that space, like you just mentioned. Like, what are like the key takeaway that you have from working there that you're like, oh, this is something that was extremely helpful as I learned like how technology works.
Hmm. I will say that something that is I would suggest to anybody wanting to get into tech, and especially if they're newer in their careers, they don't want to go the school route, is work for a hosting company or some type of tech company, which a lot of times with call centers, because they will put you through some type of
Sure,
training.
sure.
It was a 6-week training, I think. I don't remember. This was like 7 years ago. That they specifically were like, we will pay you for this training. You have one shot at the test. And if you do not pass, we're letting you go.
Oh, geez. Okay.
Like, no matter what, they're going to pay you for the training at least,
Sure, sure,
so you
sure.
have that going for you. Um, and as somebody that hates tests with a passion, like, I was really nervous. I think I was like a point away from failing. Um, but at the same time, the 6 weeks that it took is it helped me conceptualize the internet and online, and what's like how we were talking earlier about being able to take out the game from a Nintendo and blow on the cartridge and put it back in. I could conceptualize that. I can conceptualize a phone even a bit more. But when you're talking about DNS or hosting, it's like you can't touch it, you can't talk to it, like you can't feel it, you can't really do anything with it, but you got to talk about it a lot.
Yeah,
So how do you not only understand it yourself, how do you break it down for others?
yeah,
And I think that's a big reason why things like containers and serverless and data infrastructure and even Web3 is so fascinating to me, because it's really hard to understand, and
yeah,
learning how to break it down for others. Like, I think this is like my favorite thing to do in the world now is like, okay, how do I take what somebody has told me that's super super technical and make it consumable? And
yes,
I feel like I've made that, I figured that out for APIs now, and I figured out how to talk about DNS that way, or email that way, or hosting that way. Then I'm like, how do I talk about that for Web3?
sure, sure.
Ooh, how do you explain to someone what blockchain is? Let's do it.
Yeah, I think that's kind of like, I don't want to say that's like the mastery of skill, but like being able to take the things that you've learned and give that information or give that sort of content to somebody else who doesn't know, like that's, I guess that is some level of being adequate in something, right? Like I've never seen, I guess that's not true. I've seen people that they try to talk about something but they really don't know about it. I'm guilty of it sometimes myself, and it just doesn't seem very genuine. You're just like it. I think the biggest thing that we can do is just be honest with folks. Like, oh, this was hard for me to learn. Let me give you some of the tips that I use to learn how to do these things with
Mhm.
my own little spin on it, which I think is really really cool. I think also like the idea of like learning in the open is so fascinating to me. It's because like we talked a little bit about like neurodivergency, like, and I would love to kind of get your thoughts on like what are some of the things that you found out about yourself as you've kind of done more of this learning in the open. Like obviously some of them are good, some of them probably not as good, right? I'd love to kind of hear, have you had any sort of epiphanies?
Really quick to be for yes, I will totally answer that. I'm just using some Googles really quick.
Sure.
And neurodiversity refers to diversity in the human brain in cognition. For instance, in sociability, learning, attention, mood, and other mental functions. Well, I read all of that to say that I mentioned earlier that I am very, very dyslexic.
Sure.
So one thing that I learned, I read a book called The Dyslexic Advantage a few years ago. One of the best books. Like seriously, anybody that even if you think you're dyslexic, just go read this book. Um, and it taught me that I can listen to things on double time or triple time. If I listen to something, I can consume it so much better than if I am reading something. So even to this day, like I started doing like a daily meditation, which yes, I'm totally like moving around. I have this book
Yeah.
where I have a really hard time of always working on trying to learn how to get a daily practice or how to focus more on, and I'm not going into religion, y'all. I'm talking more like spirituality, like
Sure.
meditation, that
Sure.
kind of stuff. Um, and I've always really, really struggled with it. Where I got this book, and what I learned is if I read it out loud to myself, I struggle with a lot of the words, yet it helps me do it. And I'm like, okay, cool. Like that's cool. And in case anybody was curious, it's called Meditations on the Mat. Um, but the same thing goes to what I'm learning for code. So I have found, especially with having this book, and also like I've been working on learning TypeScript. So Josh Goldberg wrote this book,
Okay.
Learning TypeScript, and he comes on my show, and we're going to be doing going through the book together and learning TypeScript. And it helps having a physical book so I can write notes.
Yeah.
And yes, there is a virtual book. I have the virtual version so I can use text to speech. That helps me a ton because I just said I was dyslexic and hearing things on double time. I can read through it a lot better. So it's like knowing that I may need to have multiple sources because learning from Josh's book, I've already been going through Python stuff for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't know that I needed the book to be able to help with me
Yeah.
doing it online. So I got the book as well.
Sure.
So it's been a lot of learning it through multiple directions.
Yeah.
And also when Jason, how do you say his
Langsdorff.
Lingsdorf? I never say his last name out loud because I'm always like, I'm gonna butcher it. I just say Jason, learn with Jason.
Yep.
That Jason. When he was on the show, something that he mentioned was that a lot of the stuff when people are on his show that are learn with Jason, he doesn't go back through and go try to do it later. He just knows about it because he's learning about it conceptually. So
Sure.
later on, when he needs to dive into something later on, he already knows the information. And I was like, you're famous and like people like really respect, and you do that. Do you do that? Because like I thought
Yeah.
I had to do like
Yeah.
XYZ to like really dive into this. And I was like, oh, that's why so much of it makes sense. That's why I love emceeing because I can dive in a little bit, but it helps me know enough to keep a conversation going, but not too deep where I'm not asking questions that other people need to know.
Yes.
Um, Another thing that I've learned with learning in public and being neurodivergent is I am super ADHD,
Mm-hmm.
and that means that it can be hard for me to stay on task.
Sure.
It can also be very difficult for me to go from point A to point B.
Mm. Yeah.
I say that as actually, this isn't a tech reference, but this is something that recently came up as a reference. Is I was on, I ended up joining a CTO luncheon thing where I got to like hang out with a bunch of CTOs. And I was like, dude, that's so cool.
That is
And they
pretty
were
cool.
like, hey, if you want to interview, do PAR. I'm like, pardon me? What? And
Yeah.
they're like, PAR. And I'm like, what is that? And they're like, problem, action, result.
Yep.
And I'm like, cool, that totally makes sense. Um, what's the problem?
Yeah. Yeah.
And like it just doesn't click. So it's been a lot of having to ask people for patience to help me break it down and ask somebody or multiple people 1,000 different ways. So like I've met with multiple people after that call of like, okay, so I have Teach Gen Tech. How do I put that into par?
Yep.
And they were like, well, why did you start Teach Gen Tech? And I was like, because I wanted to be a DevRel. And to be a DevRel, I need the content. And so people were like, hey, if you need to learn tech and you need a content, why don't you start streaming? And I was like,
Sure.
dope, let's do it. And a week later, I did.
Yep.
But a lot of people don't see that as a problem action result because they're like, well, what was the problem for
Mm.
a customer
Oh,
or a
sure. Yeah.
client?
Yeah.
And but like somebody else broke it down for me of the problem was I needed a career, I had a career objective. So I needed content and tech skills. The action was easy accessibility from experts and having a creative approach with it. And the result is I've been able to share more of the industry with others. And
Yeah.
I was like, dude, that's cool. I never would have
Yeah.
gotten there.
It is quite funny that like sometimes we get so in the weeds that like, you know, like the cliche, like hard to see the forest through the trees, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
we we know that we're trying to do something for some particular objective, but we get so bogged down in the work itself that sometimes like it's just good to put everything down, take all the steps out and say, okay, what exactly am I trying to do here? Like in your example, I love you want to learn new things or you want to get into DevRel and you looked at other people that were that were successful in that space and you said these are the things that they look to be doing, maybe you talk to them and then you built out a plan. And I can relate that like regardless if you have ADHD or not, that's something that's really really hard, right? Like conceptualizing like a plan of attack as a singular person is very very hard because there are all these other outside stimuli that really are kind of grabbing your attention. And it only is worse if you have ADHD. Like my ADHD manifests more as like I can't context switch, right? I can't context switch very well and I lose time. Like I'll look at a clock and I'm like it's 4 p.m. like what happened? Like
Mm-hmm.
my coffee
Mm-hmm.
is like half drank. I'm like what happened for the last 6 hours? And like I have to like kind of unwind myself and figure out like what did you do all day? Like obviously
Mm-hmm.
I did stuff because I wasn't just sitting there like sleeping, but like I kind of lose that memory because things go by so quickly. And it's very very interesting because when I talk to people about the way my ADHD works, they're like, "Wow, that sounds substantially more exhausting than like not being able to like focus." And I disagree. I think they're both equally terrifying. But I think
That's so
yeah,
interesting.
it's weird. It's absolutely bizarre how like how it manifests with different people in different ways.
You should definitely, I will do an introduction. Please remind me if anybody hasn't checked this out yet. Labao Spark has a podcast and it's all about ADHD people. And we talk about it a lot there. And I hear how ADHD presents for you. And I've heard about this from so many other people too, that I'm always like, dude, I wish I had that. That'd be so cool. I'd get shit done. Where,
Yeah.
and that's the idea of like that also compares myself to others, so if I'm not careful that can cause myself to put myself down where I have to go, okay, cool, that is the way their ADHD presents. My ADHD is I have really bad executive dysfunction disorder, um, which for me what that does is I for example can't go from point A to point B. Like I am really good at comprehending really high level stuff. So when people are talking to me about Web3 or all these like really hard topics, I'm like, okay, cool, I can comprehend that. But going and doing that in like actually coding it can be very, very difficult when I'm like, I don't know what goes after this. So it can be very, very hard. And also knowing where to start. So that's a big reason that you say that like getting started and having strategy. When I started Teach Gen Tech, there was no strategy. It was just like, I'm going to do it. It's going to be
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah.
And strategy is something I struggle with,
Sure.
really, really struggle with. And it's a big reason that we talked a bit about the neurodiversity side of it. I every Wednesday I host a Twitter space called neurodiversity and or mental health and neurodiversity in tech. And a big reason that I focus on it, and I love being a part of the tech crowd and understanding these very, very logical items. And one of the biggest things that people ask me about, they're like, well, why don't you just do mental health and stuff like other places? And I'm like, because we need to make tech accessible to
Yeah,
those who struggle with these items, but also so we have it on very, very many different levels of men's mental health is not something that is talked about very often and
sure.
also not supported. So that's a big reason I'm doing it. And also making tech accessible to those who are, no offense, but not white dudes that happen to be in the industry. So like everybody
Yeah,
else.
yeah,
Um, and that's a big reason that I do it because there's all these barriers that if I can bust chuck myself, we can have these conversations. And I like talking about all this. Um, but a big part of it is when you've had 6 hours pass by and you're like, dude, where'd the day go?
yeah.
Have you ever had it where you're like, you've beat yourself up because you didn't do all the things you wanted to do because you got hyper focused on something?
Oh, sure. I mean, I beat myself up about everything. Like, I have a huge chip on my shoulder that I'll never be able to get off. Like, I'm always like chasing the next thing. I'm very guilty of like looking at the grass always greener or this offense or whatever the cliche you want to use, right? But I think one of the things that I've tried to be a bit more aware of is just making the decision, because I really get into this state where I want the first edition of something to be perfect. And like, as
Mm-hmm,
you know, as somebody who creates content, like, more than likely the first time you hit record, it's not going to be perfect.
mm-hmm,
And it's okay if you have to stop and then start again and stop. And that really frustrates me because I kind of have a bit of a, like, I like to have control over the situation, and kind of failure isn't really exciting for me. And I've tried to spend a bit more time just being okay with the uncomfortableness of the way that I am, right? Like, making decisions is hard, not being perfect is hard. Um, Trying to figure out what the next thing is I should be working on. Like, I've looked into getting like those ADHD timers, which I think are helpful for a lot of folks. I think there's also just in general, like, you have to just accept who you are. Like, I think a lot of us
mm-hmm,
in tech, not even just tech, it's in society in general, we spend so much effort trying to like fix ourselves when
mm-hmm,
sometimes we probably don't need to get fixed. Like, we just need to
mm-hmm,
be able to adapt to the way that we are a bit differently, or inform other people that, hey, did you know that, I have ADHD? It's hard for me to do these particular things. Just a warning that if you notice something that you're not familiar with, it's not me trying to do something in a negative light. It's just me being who I am. And I think that's really, really important. And I think we're going to get better over the course of as we mature in society. Like, 20 years ago, nobody talked about ADHD, right?
mm-hmm.
Like, now everybody is starting to get more and more comfortable. There's still stigma around it, but people are starting to feel more comfortable talking about, which is good. And I hope in another 20 years or another 40 years, like, there is this expectation that, yeah, if you have some sort of neurodiversity, then we can talk about it and it's okay, right? Like, I look at my kids, and my kids are substantially more evolved than I am when I was their age. Like, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, and you bring up so many good points. That is something that we've actually talked about on these Twitter spaces is parents of neurodivergency, especially if it's like the parents are neurodivergent themselves and being able to see like what they have going on with themselves. So I feel like you were talking yes in tech and like finding ourselves, but I can only imagine as parents. I'm not a parent. I'm a dog mom, but she
Sure.
actually finally fell asleep. This is exciting.
Nice.
Um, yeah, it's something that to your point of just getting started and just doing it is the scariest part.
Yes.
And one thing, like many, many things that I've learned since learning live is people are incredibly supportive. And I know a lot of that will have to do with me being a female in tech, me being a white female in tech.
Yeah.
There is a lot of privilege that I was given going into this journey. And it's something that I've learned that if I can show others that we can get through this, they can do it as well. And it's
Yep.
also made me realize, as you were just saying, talking about things of like Wesley Faulkner, he was actually the first person I talked to about going into devrel. He is over at AWS, at least as of this recording, I think he is. And he told me about being dyslexic and ADHD. And that was the light bulb I needed to be able to start teach Gen Tech, because this is why I never finished my C++ class. And it was like this weird way of hearing somebody else go through it, and that if they can do it, oh, it's like, not that they said it, but it like gives me permission to do it.
Yeah.
And that is something that I think is so important in our society now, and something I love about tech Twitter. And I am curious, what do you think about all the Twitter-ness? Are you going to jump ship to another platform?
I mean, I can talk about this pretty openly. I get very frustrated with technology sometimes. I kind of like am old man yelling at cloud occasionally. And um my 2 cents on other platforms other than the ones that currently exist that are new. Um they need to be as accessible as possible for me. I can't,
Mhm,
like, I don't have a lot of interest in like configuring my own server and setting up service discovery and like just doing have to do a bunch of extra steps. And that's, I know that's knocking one particular platform, right? But I guess from my perspective, like I want to be able to log in, see stuff I care about, and interact with people that are in my network, or people that I might be interested in enjoying their networks, right?
mhm,
Um, and I know that we're gonna get there. We also might get to a point where the existing platforms might stabilize, and these
mhm,
conversations about moving to other platforms aren't necessary. Um, I have created accounts on other platforms, and whenever I go to like check my stuff, I just get kind of overwhelmed
mhm,
sometimes. So I guess from my perspective, if there's a forcing function that causes me to have to move, I definitely will. But
mhm.
I'm probably going to be the last person on Twitter. Like that's like I think that's kind of my thought process. I would love, like, what are your thoughts? Like, as somebody who, it seems to me like based on this conversation, is far more interested in a little bit of pain than I am, like learning new things. Like, is this something that is exciting for you, or is it also kind of dragging mentally?
Um, Interesting that you say that. That is something that I think is a good call out. Is, and I won't go into all of this right now, but if anybody wants to know, I've been through a shit ton of trauma growing up. It's all on the podcast side of things, called Shit You Don't Want to Talk About. The website for that one is shit, the number two talk about,
Hmm. Hmm.
shit2talkabout.com. I say that because I don't want to bring down the conversation. I think that it made me realize that I can get through a lot of this pain, of switching platforms or learning something. But that being said, this is why I avoided Twitter for so long. I just started using Twitter, like actually tweeting, in June 2022. I've never used Twitter before that. I never
Mm.
posted on TikTok. I kind of got into Instagram. Facebook was kind of weird. LinkedIn, I didn't know what to do, and it's definitely something that I I think it's I definitely feel like a sheeple when it comes to social media platforms, and by that I mean I will just follow the herd wherever they're going. I'm going to go. I'm not an early adopter when it comes to that. Uh, I feel like on a lot of things, I'm not an early adopter. I'm more of a let other people test it out. Then I'll go, but then I want to do what's needed to bring everybody else with us.
Sure.
But I want other people to do the hard work. Like,
Yes.
figure out if it's working, is it broken, is it going to like actually stick? And then let's bring people with us and make it more accessible. And I think that's something that I liked a lot of the platforms. I think they all have something cool. I just get lost in how many I need to check, why am I checking them, what do I need to use them for? Because for my Teach Gen Tech show, Twitter is mainly the main one, maybe like LinkedIn or Mastodon, where for my podcast, it's mainly TikTok and Instagram.
Sure.
So it's a lot of more that goes into the marketing side of things than the logical side of things that as a content creator and as learning live and doing tech and human connection, I'm like, there's
Yeah.
there's only so much I can take on at
Sure.
once.
Yeah. I totally respect all of that. Like I think and everybody's going to make their own choices, right? Like some people
Mhm.
decided immediately like they have sound disagreements with the course of certain platforms and they're going to move. And that's fine. I respect them. I'm
Mhm.
just saying for me, and this is hard because part of my job is like being in like social media and being on, tech, Twitter, and all these things, right?
Mhm.
Um, but I think at the end of the day, like it's really, really essential for us to do the things that bring us joy,
Mhm.
right? And if me putzing around with like where my content is gonna go brings me joy, that's cool. That's great.
Mhm.
um, I want to focus on connections, right? So that's doing things
Mhm.
like this. It's, I love to go and speak at events. So going to go speak at events. And that's only a part of my job. But I think the biggest thing is like I only have so much time. Like I have a friend of mine who tragically says like we only have so many keystrokes in our hands, right?
Mhm.
And I love the fact that it's like you have to do things that bring you some form of value, right? And for
Mhm.
me, that figuring out where I post my content to isn't super important, which I'm guessing is probably a bad thing because I'm in DevRel, but it doesn't matter. I think from my perspective, I'd much rather spend it on things that I do enjoy.
What and please let me know if I'm overstepping.
No, no,
What
you're
I
fine.
hear is that you care more about, and this is a phrase that I was told many, many moons ago from a manager, is that I'm a mile wide and an inch deep, meaning that I like learning about everything all at once. But it sounds to me like if we use that as a reference to connection, you care more about building very, very deep connections with someone rather than the hitting like the masses. And I think that is at least what I'm
Yeah,
picking up from the way you describe that.
yeah, we can go. I can spend the next 20 minutes talking about all of my personality quirks. I think from my perspective, I at one point in my life I was very extroverted, like probably like negatively too extroverted. And over the course of time, I I still am pretty extroverted. Like I can go and meet and talk to anybody and it's enjoyable for me. But I also get very tired of it quicker. So I think
Mhm.
I've become more of a like what's the phrase like an extrovert introvert, like somebody
Mhm.
who doesn't mind talking to people, but they get exhausted from it pretty quickly. Um, I do like the idea of like kind of like spanning my breadth of people I talk to, things I learn, stuff like that. Um, but at the same time, I also run into this thing a lot where I have a hard time learning new things if I'm not interested in them. So like I need to
Mhm.
have like some catalyzing moment where I need like, oh, I need to learn this thing because it's of value to me in this one particular area, right? Like we were talking before the stream about setting up like OBS, for instance.
Mhm.
I wanted to look better on camera because I only got what God gave me. So I want to look better on camera. So in order to do that, I got to learn like how to look good on camera. And
Mhm.
that was kind of the catalyzing moment for that, or the thing that moved me forward. I have a hard time in some areas. Like I've joked on the show tens of times. Like I've tried to learn Go, the programming language, like 100 times.
Mhm.
Like I go with the tutorial, I do everything, but the knowledge never sticks. And it's probably because I don't put
Mhm.
enough practice into it, or
Mhm.
I haven't found like a definitive reason to like learn that particular technology stack really um, when I had no other options. And
Mhm.
because of that, I've kind of lost a lot of motivation. So like that's just a little subset of Isaac's kind of uh, idiosyncrasies. But I think that the biggest thing, to go back to your original question, was I really enjoy talking to people about all sorts of things. Like I don't mind having awkward conversations about politics or religion or Kubernetes or whatever with people. Like I don't like
Mhm.
it is what it is. Like because I understand that I'm a bit different than the person that I'm talking to. And if that person
Mhm.
can convince me, like that's great. But also at the same time, I respect the fact that I'm very hard to convince. So it's
Okay.
interesting. Like it's fun because I get opportunities to do things like this, talk to folks like you, and it's really valuable for me. But I think the big thing that I want to kind of summarize that phrase, that whole thought process with is like I do this because this helps me. So there is some selfishness to it. I'm not doing this for the greater good. I'm not doing this to promote my guests. I promote my guests because it's a nice thing to do, but I do it to learn myself personally.
I think that's very fair because, and some things that like pop in my head as you're talking is like, definitely, I think we all have we sometimes need to analyze why we're doing things and
Sure. Yeah.
also to be okay that a lot of times they can be very selfish and that's okay, you
Hmm.
know. But I feel like that's like a philosophy talk that we could just
Yeah.
like talk about forever.
Exactly.
um I am, and I find it very interesting how you were talking about Go specifically. I had somebody come on my show to talk about Go because I was like, I keep hearing about it. Everybody keeps talking about it, but I don't get why it's so cool and why it's so complicated.
Sure.
So yeah, I walked away from this conversation going, I don't even
Hmm.
know what you just said to me. Cool. And where like OBS, for example, on that example, I'm like, I haven't even learned how to use OBS enough because I'm like, I don't see, is it a different enough than a tool I can use that I can learn very quickly? And I think that goes back to the same thing with the social media platforms. On like what is going to be the like ease of access to be able to make a bigger impact.
Yep.
And I find all of this so interesting and it really does go into tech on like how we're going to learn things, what we're going to do with it, and is it going to be worthwhile for us?
Yeah, I think that and this goes back to our conversation about learning, right? I think we all learn in different ways. Like,
Mhm.
you showed like a couple of books, right? Like if you went back 20 years, everybody learned from looking at a book because
Mhm.
there wasn't Udemy courses, there wasn't hundreds and thousands of hours of YouTube videos to watch, there wasn't Twitch live streaming, so you had to go buy a book. Nowadays,
Mhm.
like when you see somebody holding up a book, like I'm not gonna lie, like I was like, oh, you bought a book. That's kind of cool.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
and I think there's value in understanding that people learn differently, and
Mhm.
trying to teach somebody how to do something the way that you feel most comfortable learning, it probably won't end well. But if you do it
Mhm.
in a way that provides empathy to the fact that like this person doesn't know how to do this thing and you can help them, that's where you really win.
And I think that's like such just like I know we're coming close up on time, but
Sure.
like that's just like such a good part is like empathy. It goes
Hmm.
into all of this, everything we've talked about, everything in DevRel and tech and all of it. Like empathy is something to get excited about because it's what creates the connection to make all this tech happen.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the most important thing that I love to talk about is like, what brings you joy? If you find other people that are talking about what brings you joy, they can help you. And look, let's
Hmm.
be real. Like some people don't want to help other people. That's totally fine. That's your agenda.
Hmm.
But like if you're on Twitter, if you're on Twitch, if you're on YouTube or whatever, and you're like providing value, like most like we were talking before the stream about like the fact that I've had some pretty cool guests on my show, right?
Hmm.
The only reason why those folks said yes is because they're cool people, right?
Hmm.
I have a lot of people that I've reached out to that have either not responded to me or they said no,
Hmm.
right? And that's okay. So like I think that's the thing is you find the people that are kind and you find the people that are interesting and you follow along with what they're doing and maybe you'll find something that you both share that you can work on and build a career out of it.
Agreed. Agreed. And I think that's a big way of really looking into it. And that's what I had to do for my show too,
Mm-hmm.
is I've reached out to so many people. There were plenty that didn't reply
Sure.
or that replied like 6 months later, which is okay
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
I do that. I do that all
Yeah.
the time where I'm like,
Yeah.
shit, I forgot to reply to them. And it's been 6 months. And that's again another conversation of the shame and that can go into all of this.
Yeah. No, I mean, and I think one of the things about, like you just mentioned the word shame, that's really interesting to me is like we have to do better in tech of not making people feel uncomfortable because we don't do things the way they do,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, I mean, like we talked about this already. Like my visibility or my opinion of tech is substantially different because I'm a straight white guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, somebody else that's different, has a different background than me, has a completely different understanding and a different opinion on how things are in tech. And if we can have empathy, again, to talk about empathy with those folks, it's going to make the entire industry just a little bit better. No, I'm not talking about moving mountains. I'm just like talking about like just like taking like one step forward.
And that empathy and awareness helps break that shame. And it's these small steps that will eventually move a mountain. Maybe
Yeah.
not in our lifetime, but small steps over and over again is what it takes to get started and get things moving.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think, this is a great way to kind of sum up the conversation and finish it off. Um, I I love asking my guests like one last question at the end of the show, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it. So, if you could kind of
Sure.
take all of the things that we've talked about today, and tech, open source, empathy, how we can do better in tech, and your thoughts on tech in general, and you only had one word to describe that feeling or that happening that you have, like what would that word be for you?
Curiosity.
Curiosity. That's a good one. I think we've had that a couple of times, and I don't disagree with it at all. And that I think we're this is comes to an end to our hour, right? I want to thank you so much, Jen, for being on the show and just chatting with me about all sorts of different tech topics. And did you have any last parting words before we sign off?
Just uh, blah, 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 words.
Those are
Uh,
words. Those are words.
those
Listen,
are
I told.
words. We'll make up some words. Is no matter where you are in your career, in your journey, is there's always going to be somebody that's doing it better than you. There's always going to be somebody that's doing worse than you. And just getting started is taking a huge step.
Yes, totally agree.
And fuck it, let's do it.
Yeah, I can't agree more. Let's just say that. And for folks that might not be following Jen already, it's Jenn Junod on Twitter. And there'll be some links to some of the other stuff, including her podcast that she talked about in the show notes when this show gets published. So again, thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you so much, Jen, for being on the show. And this is a pleasure. I'm Isaac Levin. Thank you so much for tuning into Coffee and Open Source. We'll see you next time.